When it comes to bass fishing, knowing what the temperature of the water is in your area and understanding its impact on the bass, it means the difference between putting fish in the boat or leaving skunked. Look at the size of that bass. That is a monster bass. Look at the size of that guy. Here on the east coast of Canada, a lot of people are fishing bass like they would fish for trout. Trout fishing is way more prevalent here in Nova Scotia, and bass fishing is relatively new. When it comes to temperature, it's night and day. As you can see on this graph, the bass thrive between 50 degrees and 85 degrees. When the water temperature is in between there, I mean, you can catch bass all day long. Where with trout, it's a little narrower. Generally speaking, between 40 and 65 degrees is a good temperature, good water temperature for trout. But anything above that, and the trout are moving into deep portions of the lake, into the cooler areas, and they're moving and feeding less. Both bass and trout are cold-blooded, but bass are warm-watered fish. Warm water fish. Trout are really cold water fish. So basically what that means is that bass will thrive in warm water, and up to 85 degrees, bass will be quite active. In fact, when the water temperature here in Nova Scotia, I mean, we never have to worry about it getting up to 85, but when it hits around 70 or 75 degrees, the water temperature, bass are extremely active. And when you hook onto one, you got to hang on because they'll go nuts. They'll come out of the water and come flying out. Whereas with trout, if the water temperature is around 70 or 75 degrees, they're going deep into the lakes and they're down into the cooler portions because they're cold water fish. They much prefer the cold water. And in fact, if you've ever been ice fishing and you've visually been able to see bass at the bottom of a lake, they don't move a whole lot, whereas trout are still fairly active. The other thing is that bass, big bass will thrive in shallow water, where big trout typically will go to the deeper parts of the lake. So there's big differences in between the two species. Below 50 degrees, bass are pretty lethargic. For me, drop that lure right in front of their nose and an extremely slow retrieve with long pauses. They're not willing to chase stuff at that temperature. Between 45 and 55 degrees, bass are starting to get a little more active. Now, I'm using a slow retrieve. I'm still kind of dropping it near them, and I'm still using long pauses. The fish are willing to chase the lure, but not that fast. But you also have more options for fishing, and you can throw different types of lures out now at this point. I don't care what anybody says, but when the water temperature hits 55 degrees, that's the time for active fishing. It gets crazy. And at 55 degrees, the bass are starting to feed heavily. It becomes quite frenzied. They're really willing to chase lures right now at that stage of the game, and they're in the pre-spawn. They're fattening up and getting ready to spawn and build nests and defend nests. So they're quite active. 55 degrees is my magic springtime water temperature. Once the water hits 65 degrees, the bass are going to move into the spawning mode, and they'll move into their spawning beds, start building nests. The bite is completely different than when they're frenzy feeding. This is more territorial and more reactionary. The bite is completely different. They also move less cover less ground. I'm using a slower retrieve, dropping it right on top of them, um, um, giving it slow, long pauses in between. It's still a great time to fish, but it's 2 or 3 weeks before they come out of it, and the males are, and they're protecting their fry. Once they come out of it and they get into summer feeding, then the fun starts all over again. During the summer months here in Nova Scotia, the lakes typically don't ever really get up above 85 degrees, but when they hit 70, 75 degrees, it's a lot of fun. The bass are still extremely active at this point. I'm using to a medium to fast retrieve, and still sometimes doing slow pauses, but the bass are getting they're aggressive throughout the summer, and they're willing to chase stuff down. That's not a problem. It's fun because you can play with a lot of different lures, a lot of different options when you're fishing. Once the temperature hits above 85 degrees, the bass are going to become really lethargic. There's not going to be a whole lot of oxygen in the water. You can still fish them. It's going to be a slow retrieve. They're going to be moving to deeper water. Once it hits 100 degrees, your bass, well, guess what? Bass fishing is done in that lake. Bass will die once the temperature hits 100 degrees. So let's hope we don't ever have to deal with that. In early spring, when the water is still really cold, most of the bass are sitting in deeper water, usually in hollows or pockets of water. And once the temperature hits 55 degrees, they'll start to move inshore towards points of land, and they'll start feeding off of the bait fish. At 55 degrees Fahrenheit, this is when the fishing really starts to kick in and the pre-spawn is on. The fish are fattening up and getting ready for the spawn. Nice bass. Wow. I knew there'd be big bass here in amongst these weeds. So great spot for bass. Once that water temperature hits about 60 degrees, 65 degrees Fahrenheit, the bass are going to move from the points of land, and they're going to move into the spawning beds, and they're going to start creating nests and spawn. During this period, they don't feed a whole lot. The bite is completely different. It's not like feeding. It's more like territorial or defending the nest. It's a completely different way of fishing. And I'll have another video on that topic for sure. There we go. Nice bass. Nice bass. Ho, 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 ho. Nice bass. Wow. That's a big one. Nice bass. Come on, girl. Wow. During the pre-spawn, as the water temperature increases on the lake, bass will also move up to the top of ledges. This is a great spot to fish. They're right in ambush mode and feeding off of bait fish and things like that come in the area. It is just so much fun to find a ledge and just fish off of that. Did you see that? Holy jumps, there you go. That was a nice one. Yes, indeed. That's a nice little guy. The actual spawn can last a couple of weeks. Things are pretty slow at that point because the fish aren't biting like they normally do. Once the temperature rises and once they finish spawning, the fish will move out and they'll split. Some of them will go to deeper water and some of them will go back off the points and some will stay in shallow water. So they really diversify and spread through the lake at this point. So let's face it, everything I've been talking about so far is based on ideal conditions. Not everything's ideal. There's obviously some variables. I think most fishermen will agree that barometric pressure, rain, wind will change the way fish react. if there's a lot of runoff, even, the time of year, what season you're in, and the fishing pressure, shade or direct sunlight. What's the water clarity, if it's muddy or if it's clear. There's so many other factors that you just need to know the area that you're fishing and become familiar with it so that you can deal with it on the fly while you're fishing. Wind can really affect the water temperature on a lake. Wind coming off the land can sometimes cause the water to kind of backflow into the shoreline, and that water next to the shoreline actually be a lot colder than in the middle of the lake. This is something that you should be really aware of, that not all parts of the lake are the same temperature. As well, direct sunlight coming down heats the top portion of the surface of the lake. We all know that water columns through the lake can differ greatly, and you can have several different water columns that have different temperatures, so that can be an issue as well. And of course, finding pools or little shallow coves. I fish in a spot that has an island sheltering it, and the lake floor comes up drastically, and that whole cove is extremely warm as heated up by the sun. It's a great spot to fish in the summertime. The temperature of the water column can also dictate where the fish sit, whether they sit close to the bottom of the lake or whether they sit suspended. And how you fish them can be two different methods altogether. You just want to be careful that, and you're watching your fish finder, that if you're fishing, that you know whether those fish are actually suspended or on the bottom. It makes a huge difference in your approach. In the end, gang, just pay attention to that water temperature. It is so important. And all the best to this upcoming fishing season, and may your lines always be tight. Hey guys, thanks for all the wonderful comments. I'm glad you're enjoying these videos as much as I enjoy producing them. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel and head over to my Facebook page, Adventures Outdoors with Frank Zinck. As well, I have a Facebook group called Camping Life, and it's just tips and things for camping and meal recipes. So I hope you head on over, leave another comment over there. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching.